back. And Carl is also here in the back corner. He uses Angular on the DoubleClick team. So tonight we're going to have James talking about his take on Angular Seed and the stuff that he's been looking at for larger web applications. And later we're going to have Eric Duran come and show chromeHAR app that he built. And he's with Lullabot. So James from HBO is going to present first. And try not to use don't use the coffee grinder during talks. It's pretty loud. It comes up onto the mic. And when you ask questions, also make sure that you have a mic. So just wait a quick second, and Carl or Robbie will run over to you for a mic, because this is being recorded, and we'll put it on YouTube so that other people can see this talk. And another thing is we're going to have lightning talks from now on. So quick 5-minute show and tell sort of thing of what you're working on or what you're struggling with Angular. So starting next month, if we get enough people signed up for lightning talks. So go sign up on our Meetup page. Thanks.
Are they going to be the same meeting?
Yeah, the lightning talks will be together with these presentations. Yep.
Is that good? Yep. Good? Awesome. Cool. Hi, everyone. This is the second time I'm getting a chance to talk to the Angular community here in New York, and I'm really excited. I've been working a lot with Angular, both professionally and personally with a lot of my own stuff, and so I've gotten quite a bit of experience with it, and the team that I work with has gotten quite a bit of experience with it, and we've formed a few ideas about what challenges we think it is that people getting introduced to Angular are running into. When you first begin to explore Angular, I'd imagine most people go online, they look at the documentation, they go through the tutorial, they browse the API, that sort of thing. When it comes time for you to actually put that to practice in your own application, the first thing you're given is this Angular Seed app, which is a wonderful starter tool, right? It gives you the very beginnings of an Angular app. The problem with the Angular Seed app is that it's not very useful past those initial exploration phases. They have this sort of package mechanism of stuffing. Is this getting too loud for anybody else, or is it just my own head? Okay. So they package everything inside of controller and services files, and things aren't organized in a way that scales sensibly. So if you're trying to build an enterprise scale application, or you're trying to build an application that you may be interested in looking at in 3 weeks, the Angular Seed app is not a great place to start. So rather than leave everybody to their own ideas about how to build the beginnings of meaningful Angular infrastructure, I thought that I would fork the Angular Seed app and create something that might be more useful. So I created what I'm calling Angular Sprout. So the idea is I'm taking the Seed app and giving it the very beginnings of what you need to build this thing out into a useful application. So in creating the Angular Seed app, that worked. Awesome. In creating the Angular Seed app, I realized I had to think about what it is I wanted a good Angular Seed application to do. What do I need when I'm starting as a developer and I have nothing else? And for me, there were 3 primary criteria. The first is that a good Angular Seed app, or good Seed app in general, anytime you're firing up a new programming language for the first time, should be opinionated. Angular is a powerful, powerful framework, which means that there's lots of different ways to do things. It doesn't help you when you're learning for me to show you every single one of them. You can figure those out as you go along. You want to know, how should I do it? What's the best way to do it? Or what's a sensible approach to do it? It may not even be the best way, but what's a sensible way to approach this? So I made my Angular Seed app very, very opinionated. The second is that it needs to scale. The current Angular Seed application does not scale. So if you were writing an application and you started to put together a few hundred modules in this application, it would, you would have a controller file that got out of hand. You would, your services would become a big kludge, and it would be hard for your developers to find, different concerns. And the third criteria was that a good seed application needs to be just light enough. And this is important because it needs to be light. You don't want to have to spend a day stripping out some baseline architecture just so that you can get started. But you also want this thing to have enough so that when you have a question, there's probably somewhere in the seed app where you can find an answer immediately. When I started using the Angular seed app, one of my first questions was, how do I build a meaningful directive, right? And that was hard to find. That information is actually surprisingly difficult to find. And when you do find it, there's so many different opinions about how it is you go about doing it. And even when you're doing it correctly, you could be doing it correctly in a different way depending on your architecture. So I wanted to make sure that I included a directive and I included a filter and I included all of the things that I think people have initial questions about, but not go too far. So let's talk about how the Angular Sprout app is opinionated. Oh, that looks weird on my screen. That looks fine. Okay. So one of the things that I think we need to keep in mind when we're building Angular applications is I'm fond of saying that I think Angular is the first enterprise like JavaScript library, and that's up for debate. But I come from a heavy backend background. And specifically .NET, and one of the nice things that .NET gives you is this huge standard library of, you get dependency injection, you get a bunch of enterprise design patterns all in one. And for the first time, I felt comfortable in a JavaScript environment in a way that Backbone and some of these other applications haven't been able to do. Knockout does the binding thing that Angular does, but it doesn't give you some of the cool controller and services. You have to build all that stuff in yourself. Well, it does controllers, but it doesn't do things like dependency injection natively and a lot of stuff like that. So we're building an application. We're no longer building websites. And when you're structuring an application, you structure it very differently than when you're structuring a website. The Angular Sprout application that I built, the first thing I did, and the first opinion that I'm enforcing, that's a weird way of saying that, but the first opinion that I had is that we should organize our modules based on their concern. So having a catch-all file for controllers is not a good way to develop. As a developer, I'm asked to build something. I'm asked to build a menu. I'm asked to build a form. And so we should put all of the concerns for that form or that menu in the same folder as though we were building widgets or modules. So in my folder structure for the Angular Sprout application, the controller, if a controller, a service, a directive, and a filter are all sharing a concern, are all attempting to build one widget, they all sit in a folder together. And everything sits in a folder. Everything gets treated like a module. Even the application bootstrap gets put into an application module. That way, you can give that to a developer and say it's your job to maintain the routes, and it's your job to maintain the default CSS file. That's all sitting in in the top level application folder. One of the other things I did is say we shouldn't have our hierarchies be too deep. So I said the Angular Sprout app isn't going to have hierarchies deeper than 3 levels. Now this isn't something that I think will necessarily work with everybody, but there's this assumption that as our IDEs are getting powerful, it's acceptable to throw, source files wherever it is they seem to fit, and I don't think that's true. I mean, no matter how good our IDEs get, I still love to root around in terminal, and I don't want to have to do cd/blah blah 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 blah. Even with tab completion, it's a pain. So I'm trying to be developer centric, and I'm trying to use conventions to make it really easy to navigate and really easy. I don't want you to think too hard about where you have to put something. It should be obvious. And if we only have 3 levels of hierarchy, it makes it a little bit more obvious. So as you can see here on on one side is how the Angular seed application currently works, which is that you have a top-level application folder, and then you kind of have a standard website hierarchy, a CSS folder, a JS folder, partials folder, images folder, that sort of thing. And that's just not helpful when you have several hundred different files to deal with. With Angular Sprout, I don't even know if it's visible at this level. It's a ridiculous font I chose. But the level below the app node has, can you see this? Yes, you can. Has an application folder and a details folder for the detail level of the detail views. And I have a date time folder that holds a to-date string filter. And these things work, you can see it working a little bit like namespaces do in your traditional compiled languages. And so that was the idea. And this is just the beginning. I really hope that I get a lot of feedback on how to structure this even better. But again, like I said, I wanted to start with opinions. The second point is that I need this to be scalable. So we need to use conventions to make sure that it's really easy for me to know where to put a brand new module when I create it. And so doing something as simple as putting together a naming convention so that I know what to do with my controller, I know what to do with my partial, I know what to do with my services, my directives, and my templates. And I use templates to define partials that belong to directives. It was really important. And so so I have this idea of files and namespaces over throwing things into packages. And the namespaces part is really important because this is just good old-fashioned JavaScript, good JavaScript. We were taught a long time ago that the global namespace is not a good neighborhood, right? We don't want to hang out there. We want to make sure that we're namespacing our things properly. So I wanted to give it to you up front. And the guys that created the Angular seed app intentionally wanted to keep things lightweight. I'm pretty sure that the people behind Angular have heard of JavaScript namespaces, but they were trying to keep things light to keep you from getting confused. I'm trying to give you a little more to keep you from getting confused. So I think they're two different approaches. And so right up front in the Bootstrap JS file, I'm creating the main application namespace, and underneath that I'm creating namespaces for the controllers, namespaces for the filters, the services, and the directives, and instantiating the modules right up front so that this doesn't have to be done every single time you create a new module. And the third point is that this application, the Angular Sprout application, needs to be just light enough. And like I said, it's this idea that I should give you enough that you can reference a new idea really easily, or reference how to implement a new idea really easily, but not so much that you're removing things. So the three things that, three ways in which this, three examples in the Angular Sprout app of how this works is that I have real filters, real directives, and real tests. So I try to give you things that are not quite trivial, right? So they're a simple directive, but a directive that works like a directive that uses a link function, and a directive that that handles an event, a directive that has an isolated scope. These things that we're going to need to do when we're building. And I remember trying to figure out scope when I first started using directives, and that was like 3 days of my life. It's so much work, and it's powerful. That's because directives are powerful. And so I just wanted to give you, this is how I do a directive. You can take this, you can copy it, and you can create a million directives like this, and it's perfectly okay. There's lots of other ways to do it, but this is how I want to do it. And filters were the same thing. The filter, I think that was included with the Angular seed app, just printed the version number of the seed app, which wasn't a helpful way to show you how nobody's going to use a filter that way. Filters are used to actually filter things. They need to take an input and give you an output. So I wanted to give you a real filter. Real tests. This one, we don't have time to get into tests during this talk, but real tests are really important. And hopefully I get a chance to do another talk about testing in Angular. But testing in Angular is interesting because JavaScript testing is just kind of a new thing. It's not a thing we've really taken seriously up until recently. And the examples that you find on testing in the Angular documentation, I don't think are the best way to test your app. There's this idea of end-to-end tests, and there's this idea of unit tests. And so there's this idea of unit tests and this idea of end-to-end testing. And often for things like filters and directives, the Angular documentation uses end-to-end testing. And it works because you can manipulate the DOM inside of an end-to-end test. But the problem with that is that if you're in an actual enterprise environment, if you're working, the people writing the end-to-end test is probably QA, because you got to remember the end-to-end tests have a different test runner than the unit test runner, and so you're messing up your workflow, right? So you're going to have two different test runners running at the same time, running two different types of tests just so that you can test one thing. And so what I'm not going to get to go into it in this presentation, but one of the things that you'll see in the Angular Sprout app is how to test directives and filters using unit testing techniques, not end-to-end testing techniques. So you're actually testing logic and not testing implementation. And then showing you how to use end-to-end tests properly to test implementation, to test things like navigation and entire scenarios, what happens when a person attempts to log in or create something, that kind of thing. So just light enough. You can check out the Angular Sprout app on my GitHub. I'll also post it on the meetup. And I wrote a blog post basically saying everything I've just said up here if you guys want to go over it again. So what I want to do now is show you guys the actual Angular Seed app and walk through it. And then if anybody has any questions, I would love to talk to you about why I did the things I did. So this may work and it may explode.
Just like that.
Yeah. All right. Does that look horrifying? A little bit. All right. So I'm going to shrink all these things down. So the root level of the Angular Sprout app looks pretty much like the Angular Seed app. There is something that I've done different. And one of the things that you'll notice right up front is that I have this E2E folder, this end-to-end folder in the root. And what this end-to-end folder is doing is it's giving you a place to put just your end-to-end tests. And the reason I've put this on the root is because I've discovered that the people who are probably going to be the most interested in your end-to-end tests are going to be QA, either you putting on a QA hat or an actual QA person, somebody that's going to be writing scenarios to test whether or not this thing actually does what you said it does. So I don't believe end-to-end tests and unit tests should live side by side. They're two very different things meant to test two very different concerns. And I actually find that the Angular, or that I'm using Testacular in this in the Angular Sprout app, and I think they just upgraded the Angular Seed app to Testacular. But one of the nice things that I'm going to say that wrong. It's going to be horrible. One of the things that Testacular gives you, and is now I'm distracted. Is this ability to write your end-to-end tests and your unit tests using basically the same syntax, using kind of the Jasmine syntax, and it can get really easy to throw everything in together. So I just want to give you a quick, kind of show you what I mean by an end-to-end test. So in this end-to-end test, what I'm doing is I'm testing the general layout of the Angular Sprout app. And what it's doing is I have this collection of views that come with the Sprout app. And it's looping through the views and making sure that the basic layout elements are the same for every view. So right now it's just checking to make sure that there is a menu on every single view. I'm sorry. I think so. I have.
You dim the front lights too?
Oh, that I don't know how to do. I actually have no idea how to make the font bigger.
Control-Shift+.
Control-Shift.
What?
What? Command plus. Oh, look at that. Fancy. Awesome. So yeah. Sorry about that. So this is one of the simple end-to-end tests that I give you. But again, I want to have an opinion about how you should be using the end-to-end tests. You shouldn't be you shouldn't be writing a test for every single page that makes sure that your header is in the right place. That is a silly use of an end-to-end test, especially since they take so long to run. So this is an example. This is a technique I developed on my own, and I think it's a good thing to include. So it's an opinion I have. Like I said, remaining opinionated was really important to me. And then this home test does nothing, so it still needs a little work. So everything else about the root level is more or less the same with the Angular Seed app. So now if we get into the app folder being where everything actually lives in an Angular app, you'll see that what I've done is I've taken almost everything out of the root of the app folder, with the exception of the index.html and the index async.html. And I may even throw those into a folder, I don't know, just to keep a pattern. But inside my index, inside my index.html, you'll see that one of the consequences of this approach is that you're going to end up with a whole lot of includes, right? A whole lot of script references. And that's just fine. One of the things that this Angular Spout app doesn't attempt to give you is a build process. If you're set up correctly, your build process will take all of these things and minify them or decide what's necessary or what isn't necessary. So I don't make any assumptions about what you guys have for a build process. And I find that however badly it might mess up the head, the head of your HTML, it's what you get by separating these concerns is so much more. There's also, in the index async, I haven't spent much time in there, but in the index async.html, if you guys have ever looked at it in the Angular Seed app, there's an example about how to do lazy loading of your modules. I think it's using a third-party library, because I'm not aware of any built-in lazy loading that Angular has. So there's this you can handle however you want. If you guys are using Require or one of the other module dependency managers, you're more than free to do that. But this is one of the consequences of this approach is that if in a meaningful size app, you'll end up with hundreds of script elements. But that's just fine. It isn't a big deal. So in the application folder here is where I'm keeping everything I need to bootstrap my Angular app. And including my CSS. The CSS, in my humble opinion, should live alongside whatever module it's attempting to style, right? And there's going to be lots of folders without CSS because lots of folders and lots of modules have nothing to do with the presentation layer. But the ones that do should have a CSS right there because when you end up with several hundred CSS files, it's difficult to look through a folder to find what CSS file goes with what module you're working on, and so I believe putting everything in one place makes it so much easier. One of the other things I added is this configuration service, and what this configuration service does, it's a normal Angular service, but it's basically a constant service. It's where we allow you to define settings, operational constants. I'm going to add another one called strings. That allows you to define, things like labels and that kind of thing, and that's important, especially if you're doing something like internationalization. You want all your strings defined in one place to make it easy to replace them. Date time. Now this one is one that I've kind of struggled with. I'm not exactly sure what to do. I have this filter, and what it does is it takes like a Unix epoch timestamp and converts it to a string. And it's kind of hard to figure out where to put that. At first, I put it in my details folder because that's where that's the only place in my app so far that was happening, that I was converting a timestamp. But then I go, yeah, but somebody else is going to need it. And then I remembered that if I wasn't working in JavaScript, programming languages have long taught us how to create namespaces and packages. I know I just called that a dirty word earlier, but to define this kind of thing. And so I was like, hey, let me create a module, and inside of that module, all of my date operations are going to live. And you can see how this can be expanded, and maybe I call this utilities or something if I don't, if I don't necessarily want to, if I have, 10 filters and they all do slightly different things, you don't want to put them in 10 different folders. So, this needs some work, and this architecture needs some thought and some discussion before it's perfect, to be sure. And if you look in the actual filter itself, it's doing something. It's actually taking in the timestamp. It's parsing it into an integer, creating a date time string out of it, and sending that back. It's not entirely trivial, but it's trivial enough that it's not going to get in your way. And this is kind of what I meant by just being light enough. It shows you how to use a filter, and this is how you would use a filter. You would have lots more logic in there, possibly for your filter, but this is how a filter is actually used, and it's a question that somebody would have. I'll jump down here to the menu, and here in the menu folder is where I define everything that happens in the menu, and my menu items are defined in directives instead of being defined right inside of the partial. And if we look at the directive again, it's an actual directive with an actual link function and an actual isolated scope, an actual two-way binding on that isolated scope, and I'm expressing the opinion that we shouldn't be. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, right. I'm expressing the opinion that when you're creating a directive, you should define your templates in a separate file. Angular lets you do this in lots of different ways. I think if you get in the habit of defining some of your directives in a template and some of your directives in line, or some of your templates in line, the developers on your team are going to have a really hard time finding your templates or understanding how to modify your templates. So, find a way to do it consistently, that kind of thing. There is, I don't have any unit tests in this one. I couldn't get latest from GitHub. But if I had unit tests in the Angular Sprout app, or when you go and you clone the GitHub or the Angular Sprout app, you'll see that the unit tests live right beside here. So if I was going to test my controller, I would have a menu-controller-unit file, and with Testacular, I can use wildcards to pick up my unit tests from whatever folders I want. So they don't need to sit in one place. Testacular is powerful enough to find them wherever they are, so why should we be constrained to putting everything in a test folder? Testing shouldn't be one person's responsibility anyway. Testing should be the responsibility of the person building the module if you're taking unit testing seriously. So to create a convention to help developers do that, I want to put everything right besides it. So I'll fire it up. It doesn't do a heck of a lot. It is just a CDAP after all. Scripts. And this is pretty much it. It's just, it looks a lot like the old Seed app, and it just loads two separate views. And so the actual result isn't that much heavier than the Seed app, but it gives you a bunch of conventions so that you can take what we have here and scale it out. At work, we're using more or less this architecture. There's a few things that are different. And the application we're working on is thousands and thousands of lines of code, and when it's done will be huge, and so far this architecture has worked pretty well with us. We have a Maven build process, so our directory structure is meant to reflect our build process, so it looks a little different than what we have. But it's been really helpful for us, and it was hard for us to figure, we had a big discussion at the beginning of our project about how to do this, and so I hope to save a few people a little bit of time in trying to figure out how it is you start an Angular application. This example didn't have a lot of pizzazz, but I think it was important because this is for those of you that haven't began working in Angular yet. This is going to be one of the first questions you have. So I guess that pretty much does it from the presentation perspective. But if you guys have any questions, I would love to answer them. Questions about problems I encountered or about Angular in general. Well, not in general. I'm not on the Angular team.
Hi.
Hi.
So you have the naming convention for the JavaScript, for the modules you create, but
Sure.
Did you use a naming convention for the names of the services and the names of the modules? Because once Angular sort of runs all the code, when you need to reference the directives, you need to reference the services and things like that. The naming convention the naming convention used for dependency injection really becomes very important.
Yeah.
So if you have lots of services, lots of directives that you need to pull in, then you have to have a strong naming convention around those. Did you have a naming convention that you used, or because it looked pretty flat, it looked like a flat list?
Yeah, it's intentionally flat. Now, as far as the actual object names inside of JavaScript, I think that's what you're kind of talking about. So what did I call my service in JavaScript?
Well, it's one thing what you call it in JavaScript, but like once Angular runs that code, it doesn't matter so much because it's what it's called in the dependency injection that really matters later.
Yeah. What I did is let's pull up a menu service, for instance. With the menu service, I like the idea of keeping a name short. When I first started this, when I first started writing this, my services, for instance, this menu service would be menu service camel case, right? And my controller was something controller camel case. And then I realized if I namespace correctly, that's massively redundant. And it actually, it makes code a little harder to read, in my opinion. I don't think that part is nearly as big a deal as long as the convention that you follow is consistent. And so what I did is I kept my service names simple and I put them in a proper namespace. And so if you look up here, this is where I've defined all of my namespaces and my modules. And so all modules, all services that so for instance, here's the service module being defined. If I go back to the menu service, you can see that the menu service is being created off of this application services namespace. There's not much else I'm going to need to know. I know that whenever I need to call a menu, I inject menu and it'll be there. But as this grows, it could be possible that menu isn't good enough, right? Because somebody from a team across the hall could decide that they want a menu too, and if I haven't named it well enough, then that'll be a problem. So, and I think this is kind of what we've done at work too. I don't know. I think with controllers we're calling things something controller, but in this I might have even gotten rid of that convention to keep things simple. So I leave internal naming conventions mostly up to you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, of course.
I know you said you didn't want to answer general questions, but I have one anyways. I just discovered Angular a couple of weeks ago, and
Yeah, it's a
I was
good
just
world, isn't it?
incredibly excited by it. I had so much fun playing around. And I just started a new job as a backend developer now, and I was trying to explain to the front-end developer why Angular is this great thing, and I just couldn't. I didn't know how to talk about it in a way that was compelling enough, and I'm just curious. Sounds like you clearly have a very strong understanding of it. So, can you help me find a way to talk about it in a way which explains why it's not me just pushing the work I'm doing onto her, or
It should be like an Angular lovers support group. I've heard this conversation so much. I feel like every Angular dev kind of goes through this. So what's interesting is when I came on our team, I was a big backbone guy, and I hated knockout because of just get your code out of my declarative. I don't want code in HTML. What are you doing? That's crazy. Get those brackets out of there. And then I used it. I spent one weekend with Angular, and again, this is one of those stories that's repeated over and over again. I rewrote hundreds of lines of backbone with like a couple dozen in Angular, and I was just like done. I don't care. Put brackets on everything. Just bracket it out. And that's the thing about Angular. Angular is it's giving us. It's different from writing normal JavaScript. It's absolutely different from writing normal JavaScript, but the consequence is an amazing increase in your productivity, and it makes it really easy to think about what kind of module to create to solve what kind of problem. With Backbone, everything was a Backbone object, right? And if I wanted to solve a problem, you had views and all of this stuff, but it all looked the same, and they didn't tell you exactly how to do it. And so my best advice to you is if you have a loved one that isn't coming over to the bright side, tell them to sit down with a project of theirs for one day with Angular, and chances are they're going to come away a convert. It's different. It's a way to build entire applications in JavaScript, and that's what I've loved about it. Not that Backbone is a bad project. It has its concerns. So.
Also, there's Igor's talks at the very beginning of the Angular meetups when this all started, which would be a really good way, because Igor's one of the 3 contributors to Angular. So if you go back to the video channel in YouTube, you can see Igor speaking, and that's a really good way because Igor's really excited. Yeah. And it's even better if you can get Mishka to talk.
I'll add to that. If you go to the mailing list, there's a lot of slideshows that present Angular where people are giving presentations, and you should pick those up.
Yeah. And the other thing that surprised me is the strength of the Angular community. The documentation is getting better, we'll call it, but the community on the Google Group community is amazing. Like, I've never had a question answered so fast, in a long time, and so thoroughly. And you ask a question about something, and somebody's got a fiddle for you before you can finish typing. It's amazing. And people are brilliant. I don't even understand how they got this smart in this little amount of time. It doesn't make sense to me because I still feel like an idiot sometimes, and people are like, so it's pretty cool. Yeah.
What are best practices to avoid memory leaks, particularly in AngularJS?
Oh, that's a good question. I definitely don't address memory leaks in the Sprout app, but from what I understand about Angular, it has a lot of built-in, I guess you can't quite call it garbage collection, but it does a lot of, for instance, one of the places in which it's easy to get a memory leak is during the digest process. So when you trigger a digest, which is loosely putting it a UI refresh of an Angular view, a scope refresh of an Angular view, if the previous state of the scope wasn't cleaned up, you could end up every single time you're changing a model with huge memory leaks. But Angular does two things to help you there. One is it gives you control over the digest process. So if I'm in a service and I'm making a change, or for instance, if I'm using the Promise API or triggering an asynchronous call that's eventually going to make a digest, trigger a digest, or should trigger a digest, I can control when that digest happens and what happens after that digest or what happens during the digest. I can link to events being fired during the digest process. And so, I can't speak a lot about the memory management of Angular, but I can say that it certainly gives you more control than a lot of other frameworks I've worked with.
So I can say from my experience, probably the most common way that you end up with a leak in an Angular app is that you write a directive and then it does something outside of itself. For some reason, it needs to add an event handler to the window, some bigger thing. So what you need to make sure you do in that case is that you can say scope.$on, which is the hooking into the Angular's event broadcasting system, and say listen to the event $destroy, and then make sure you unhook whatever you've hooked up there. That means that when your particular widget is destroyed, or what the scope that it's in is destroyed, that will undo all the other stuff you've done. There's not a lot of other places that I can really imagine you would end up with a memory leak.
One place I did find memory leaks when I was first doing this was within shared scopes, sharing scopes between directives, because directives naturally share a scope. And so you can do something in one directive and forgotten you've set a variable. And one of the things that the Sprout app does is it gives you an isolated scope in the directive example that it has in there. And there's a place for shared scopes. I haven't come across it yet. In the code that I've been doing, I'm sure there's a place for it. But for the most part, isolated scopes are probably what you're looking for. You're thinking of your directive as this widget that lives by itself and can be plugged into another application without it dependency. So, yeah.
James, first of all, I'd like to thank you for this. This is really awesome stuff.
Thank you.
Because it shows that people are thinking how to build complex apps, and that's really the sought after stuff in development. I have two things to say. First, I'd love to see a testing speech about this, talk about it, because it'll be great. That's definitely missing. But my concrete question is regarding preprocessors, CSS preprocessors. How does this affect if you were to use, say, SAS or less? Because I know they use includes and they eventually output this one big CSS file, which will probably live in the head of your main file. How does this affect that?
So one of the things that I mentioned, and something I'd like to stress is, again, I don't make assumptions about your build process. If you're using SAS or one of the CSS preprocessors, you would define your SCSS files the same way you would define your normal CSS files in the modules they belong to. In production, they'll all end up as one giant CSS file, or however it is your build process puts that together. So your production deployment is probably not going to look anything like this, and it probably shouldn't look anything like this. This is a mess on production. But I feel like it's okay to do this now. We're finally at a place where it's okay to do this now because build tools that consider JavaScript have gotten advanced enough. Google Closure, the compiler, can handle those kinds of things really well. And so at work, I have to keep saying at work. I was warned today that I can't say where I work, which is just like, I feel like this is no. So it's so at work, at a major media firm
that you may have spoken about last
that I may have spoken about last week. That's on YouTube like 30 times. Right. What was I saying? At work, we use SCSS, and so we have Adam Parrish, who's our build master. I think is your official. Yeah, why not? Let's do that. We have Maven set up to handle all of our building, and so Maven has hooks into the the CSS compiler that does that kind of thing, and whatever is in production doesn't really look like our development boxes for the most part. And we have things like like comments in our index.html file that wrap the script tags that we want to be minified and concatenated, that sort of thing. So, that all depends on you. There's too many different build processes for me to force my opinion on you about what kind of build process you use. So, yeah.
I got another question. So this might be an expression of my own ignorance, but it seems like there's kind of an irony to Angular because it's produced by Google and yet really hurts SEO.
Ooh. Watch what I'm about to do here. Yeah. So, were you done? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
I
was just on ignorance, or is there some kind of?
Well, first I'll say that I've been told that. I'm sorry. So first, I've been told that the Angular team is working on this problem. I don't know exactly what they're working on. I would love to find out. But we also worked on this problem. Last month when we had this talk, I gave a presentation about how we used, and I'm not going to go through it again, but I gave a presentation on how we used Phantom.js, which is a testing tool. It's basically a headless WebKit browser in our stack to pre-render the Java, to pre-execute the JavaScript, serve it up to the client pre-executed, and then so basically we were giving you what looked like a static page, but the Angular hooks let you keep on working dynamically. So there, you can go on and you can go online and find the YouTube clip. Look at last month's meetup, and Adam and I gave a presentation about exactly how to solve that problem. Now, for what it's worth, this was an experiment, and it's not in a production ready state. It's just a theory, but we would love, for any of you that didn't see the talk, please watch it and give us feedback, because we think it could be something that's really cool if people do something like build in an Nginx module or something like that does this pre-processing. Oh yeah, that's true. We do have several working examples. Adam has a GitHub account in which he shows how it works with Maven and not Maven, but Varnish, which is a reverse proxy caching tool, and Nginx. So and my GitHub repository shows how that works with kind of a trivial node server. But yeah, so please fork that stuff and run it on your machines and give us feedback, because we think it's got a lot of potential. Yeah.
I actually wanted to jump in about the previous topic about the build system stuff. You are making one assumption about my build system with this. And you mentioned, ironically, you mentioned Clojure compiler in there.
Oh, sure.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Or
are you talking about my Clojure, my JS doc hooks?
No.
Oh, actually, never mind then. I have no idea.
What's going to happen to your injection there?
Yeah, this injection is going to break. That's for sure. And this is one of the things that's, I guess, is incomplete about my my Sprout app. And so what he's referencing is, if you run this through, your minifier probably has settings, but if you run this through a minifier, things like configuration will get turned into A or B or something like that. And that breaks the dependency injection in Angular. Angular gives you a really easy fix for this that I was either too lazy or too tired to do, which is to make the function that actually contains your service or whatever module you have the last element of an array, and then the preceding elements of the array are the string values of the injected modules. Did that make any sense? I don't know. But the idea is that you can define strings that indicate what your injected modules will be, so that if you run it through a minifier, you'll have these strings to indicate what should be injected. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's actually something I need to fix.
Yeah, I have a quick comment on the memory leaks over here, James.
Oh, hey there. I know that guy.
I just posted a comment to the meetup comment section, and there's a link to a YouTube video where they discuss using Google developer tools to diagnose and squash your memory leaks.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yes. So every Angular app I've seen so far, there aren't that many, usually starts off with a one main app, and it loads. I guess that's your bootstrap.
Mm-hmm.
When you're thinking on a much larger scale, is that realistic, or do you need to break it up into multiple?
You mean, for instance, having that initial app.js file define all the routes, that kind of thing?
Right, with all the routes, which I think in an enterprise app, you probably don't want to do that if for no other reason, for security purposes, you don't want to.
That's a really good point. There is no reason that I'm aware of that you couldn't put routes in their own route folders. Or if you're following, if any of you have ever worked with any other major MVC pattern, in Node or Ruby, you can define routes, in your modules, right? So you can have, you can have a routes with, you can create a module and then put a routes, put a routes file in there that defines the routes that that module is concerned with. I didn't do that here, and most of that is because like at work we have a pretty big Angular app going, and we seem to be okay with the way our routes are structured. But it is growing. That routes file is growing, and it may be necessary to put them in separate files. But that's a great idea. I would that's something I'll definitely.
It wasn't an idea. It was more of a question. So just a brief follow up. So you don't have any privilege routes that you would want to hide from?
Not in this app, and
well, obviously not in this.
Yeah.
app.
Oh, you mean like in the one? I'm not exact. I didn't build most of our routes, so I'm not exactly sure how we're handling that. I mean, all our routes, as far as I know, are sitting right there in the Bootstrap file. But that may not be the best way to approach it going forward.
So I mean, there's two parts to that. There's like reusable components. Let's say you come up like a lot of banking apps. Have like price grids and stuff like that. You could develop those as like reusable components and let your build process like zip them up and like move them around into the clients that use them. We're trying to structure our projects into like implementation projects, like I'm not even going to say what they are, and then there's like components, like the low-level building blocks of the app. We're using Nginx aliases to like point to them in local environments. I mean, there's like a way you can kind of structure to reuse things, but to your point on like privileged routes, you could configure those based on loading particular. Yeah. So I mean, we haven't done it because none of our stuff is like really secured like an enterprise app, but you could definitely do that. So it's a good idea for a blog post, I guess.
For sure.
I'll do a screen, but whatever. Hey, I'm Eric. I am Eric Duran. I'm going to be here talking. Oh, wait, before we start, don't let the shirt fool you. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I am not part of the Angular team. I'm not part of Google. I just have the cool shirt on. But you're more than welcome to ask some questions about my project. You can even like borderline Angular. I'll try to answer them, but there's probably better people in the room here to answer that for you guys. So yeah, chromeHAR. How many people know what a HAR file is? All right, good thing I put that on the slide. So a HAR file is a very simple HTTP archive file. There we go. It's a simple JSON file, and my notes aren't working, so I'm going to look back. Sorry about that. It contains all the HTTP request data, and really simple, it lets you rebuild your network waterfall. So if you're ever on Chrome and you go to the network tabs and you see all those requests, CSS, style sheet, you can actually export that, and you can view in certain tools. So if I go down a bit, you can see it's easily exported from Chrome, and you can save it. It's good for debugging. A lot of people actually save this and put it on like a build process, and they and they keep archive of them so they can see how their website has been performing. Sorry, throughout the month or day and stuff like that. So it's kind of cool. So recently I had a HAR file I wanted to view, and there's a couple of HAR viewers online. This one's a very popular one, HAR viewer, and I have the link down there. And it's really cool, right? It has graphs and has all these. Actually, you can see the requests and you can see the headers and the cache. And it worked great for what I needed. But I was like, I really want one that looks like Chrome. Like there should be one that you just drag it to. You should drag your HAR file and you should see the Chrome network tab. And I was like, someone should do that. And I tried. It's a funny thing because I tried building it with Backbone first, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. This is so complicated. And I was like, let me try with Angular, and I like whipped it up in 5 hours or something like that. So Angular is pretty good for hacking stuff up. It's also good for enterprise application, but you can do either or. So this is what my tool looks like, chromeHAR. So you can see it's very similar to the Chrome network panel. You can see all your requests and stuff like that. It's really good. One thing I should mention also, the Chrome dev tool, it's an actual HTML, JavaScript, and CSS app. So it wasn't that hard to port, but it's meant to run inside of WebKit. So it's not like I could copy the JavaScript over and stuff like that. They had to rewrite it. But I was able to steal all the CSS, which was helpful, and the images. And by steal, I mean borrow, because it's all open source. So let's see. Why Angular? All my app does is like an extreme amount of data binding, right? So I drag this HAR file there, and I just want to place it all over the page. So this is the gist of it. This is my Angular cell. I tried doing it in Backbone. There was just too much boilerplate. And Angular is like ridiculously simple data binding. Here's an example. You see my controller. I have a scope thing. I put 2 variables in there, started time and page timing, I think. And then when I want to put on the page, simple brackets on your HTML, man. Brackets, right? And like, it works. And it becomes start time. Like, no boilerplate whatsoever. Super simple. Yeah. Quick demo so you guys know what the hell I'm talking about. This would have been easier if I had cloned my screen, but I wanted the stupid slide notes. Where's my mouse? When someone sees it, let me know. There we go. Luckily, I prepped this. So let me refresh. This is all on GitHub. So it's a one-page JS app, so it doesn't need any server. I'm using the HTML5 file reader, so I actually drag the files in there, and we'll see. I'll go to my desktop real quick. I have this sample HAR file here. You can see I have sample HAR. I drag it in here, and it just loads. Very simple. You can see it's super fast, and it's like all this is like being data mined on the fly, all Angular crap. Some people here have better understanding of that. And it's pretty good. So I could click through, see the headers, cookies, see my requests, break it down. You can do all kinds of stuff, sort. You can filter at the bottom by style sheet. Documents, you can see the actual bottom panel.
Are you drawing the graphics in real time?
I am drawing the graphics in real time. And I can search. So it's a little more complicated than I'm making it seem, but the gist of it is pretty simple. Yeah, like I still have some bugs. This is the V1 that's on GitHub. I have a new one that I'm actually running locally. So you see I still have some bugs here. And when you drill down, I think the timing, I didn't put all the things. I only have like the receiving timing. And here I didn't do the actual collapsible, like you see on the headers. But it was like a quick 5-hour hack just to get something up and running. And I was like, I'll talk about this because it's kind of cool. So that's the demo. We'll go back to my slides. Actually, does anyone have any questions on this before I go back? Cool. Feel free to ask any questions at any time. I'm just rambling for an X number of times, and it'll be better if we participate together. So yeah, let's go back. So actually, just to give you an example of how simple this was, this is my controller. It's not really that simple, but the gist of it is these 5 lines. I got this update HAR in my function, and it takes data, which I do some parsing through the HTML5 stuff. And I set up an entry, and I put scope entries, and that's the gist of it, right? So the scope entry is an array of each one of those rows, which makes it look pretty simple. And then when we go to my template, 95% of the app is just that one table row, which is looping through the entry array. So you see the ng repeat does all the heavy lifting. Entry and entries, and then I have some class here. And then you can see my very detailed, specific, folder, method. I don't remember, I wrote it like a month ago, size and time, etc. The actual template is a lot more complicated than this. But this is like the bulk of the app, right? It's just the listing of those entry files, entry requests. So let's see. I might be moving too quick through this, but either way. So one thing you saw is my TRs, you can actually filter them. I shouldn't have split screen. There's a bunch of different filters apply. So I have style sheets here, documents, and the search at the top. So I was just going to go through how I built the app with different examples. It's good for beginners if you're like building an enterprise app. Maybe you correct me on certain things. So NGVP, right? It's really cool. It does all this entry and entries. But let's just move on to the next slide. Filtering my TRs. I actually have a little more complicated on the NGVP. Angular has these filters things. I think they're called filters, right? NG filters. So I have a filter, which is my query filter. And this is actually kind of cool. So all I did was put the filter, called it query, and then my search query, which you can see down here. It's not, I thought it would scale properly, but by this slide, I was running out of time, so it's going to be a little sloppy. But if you look at my filter query, you can see that my search input box here is just regular input type search. And all I had to do was add the ng model query. And as soon as you start typing there, it starts filtering the array list by whatever is in that value, which means like literally, again, I got free filter search for, I don't know, 2 lines of code. The type was a tad bit more complicated. So I have this filter called type. And you can see my type is essentially the document, style sheet, images, scripts, etc. And these essentially are a single li. Let me see if I can make the screen a little bigger. I kind of want to stop the presentation and just clone my screen so I don't have to keep looking to the back. I can't because I won't be able to see. But yeah, essentially each one of these is an li. And you see I have the ng click on them. And when you click on like something like document over here, you can see it sets the type mine time equals to text HTML. And that's just a property in my entry list, right? So I set up a property for each one of these. Like, if you go into my row, each one of these entries have a type. What was it I called it? Sorry, I'm just mine type, and they pretty much specify each one of their mine type: HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc., etc. So you can see I didn't even make this that complicated. I just typed the code right there in the ng click and equals to text HTML. This one's going to make it text CSS or style sheet, whatever it is. And that's the gist of it. Actually, it's a little more below it, but it's fine. We can skip that. Not to mess with the screen. One other thing you see here is my order by. And you can see the order by is essentially the name, method, status. So you can filter by these examples. So method, there's only get here, but if I do statuses, damn it, all 200s. But type, there you go. So we have some application at the top. And we have size. So size is a good one, right? Because they're all different. And actually it goes reverse. I thought I didn't implement that. Yeah, I think on the slide, I assume I didn't implement it. I just hard-coded it to false. But you can see each one of these table headers has an ng click. And I called the property predicate equals name sort. So that will be like name sort will be this one. This one will probably be like method sort or status sort. So this is a little complicated, right? When I built the app like a month ago, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Since then, I've learned a tad bit more. So the first example is what I did the first time. I put an ng click and I wrote code right in there, predicate equals name sort, and reverse equals false. On the newer version, I actually have an ng click with an actual function in my scope, set sort, and I pass in method or name or status or type, and that will actually handle the flipping the reverse value back and forth. Yeah, that's it. At the very bottom, you can see my ng repeat. All I had to do was add the order by, the predicate, and the reverse. Predicate is essentially what I'm sorting by, and reverse is the order, so ascending, descending, etc. Yeah, this is still kind of hard to get used to because when you do write JavaScript, you try to write like unobstructive JavaScript and like putting things in the markup. It's like, but there's a win and some good, some bad, but yeah. Let's see. Toggling active state. So this is one thing I struggle a bit with, right? So I have these CSS active classes on document, style sheet, and you can see when I click it, it's very simple. I just want this one to be active and all the others to not be active. Scripts, drill down here, my headers, cookies. So one thing I did, which I think this is probably still in place, but I think I rewrote it too. I added an ng class with the function getClass_CSS. So the style sheet has CSS, right? The documents is doing getClass docs, and the images is doing getClass images. And you can see my JS code right below it. It's just a very simple, think of it as like a key value pair. I'm just using the scope SI value. And then I have an ng click on each one of them. So it's kind of repetitive. So this one just sets SI to CSS. This one will set SI to document, and they're all sharing that one scope.si value to flip the toggle state. Kind of hacky, but it worked for me. So you can see what this does is essentially returns the selected class when the SI value equals the same thing. So here, let's say I click on style sheets, which you can see is selected here. The ng click would just say SI to CSS, which makes that get class return selected for that one li. And I do the same thing for the headers, the cookies, these tabs right here, and the same thing for the toggles stay here. Most of this could be better in a directive, like these tabs. They could probably get extracted out to components. But I didn't know about that till like last month, so there's a gap between that. Let's see. So I have been learning about directive, right? There was this really great, if you don't know what directives are, the last meetup had a very good video about it. And one thing I noticed in the directive was that he was declaring custom event bindings to like other JavaScript events. I was like, oh, this would be awesome for my app. So my first attempt at doing the drag and drop, which you can see, it's essentially how you load data into the app. Essentially this right here. Usually when you drag something there, if you try to drag an image, the browser will probably render, or if you drag a file, it'll try to download it. So the drag and drop, it's actually, let's just see my code. Very crappy code, window on drop, right? Function. And you have your E, stop propagation and all that stuff. And I was doing this to get my data, because this is outside of the Angular script, because there's no I can't do ng, you have ng click, you have ng, give me another ng example. ng repeat, right? But there's no ng drop. Like, what was I going to do, right? So I put this very hacky window on drop method there. And when someone drops the item, I get the JavaScript file. It's like in the data. It's like an E data transfer files, whatever you're dropping. And I do Angular element. I get the body because I have my Angular app on the body. And I do a scope apply, and I call my function there from the data. You have to assume I have the data somewhere over here at the top. And this worked right. This worked okay. Like I could scope apply, and it worked fine. I'll put it in there. I'll refresh everything. But it just felt like there's a better way. So I wrote the directives. So now I could do DND drag over and put my function there, or DND drop bar and pass the event. And this is essentially the code I use. I went fishing through the Angular code base for this. But essentially, I declare my module. I called in net DND because net is actually my app, so I namespace it. And then I have an array of drag start, drop. There's a bunch of other methods I put in there, so I just cut it off because it didn't fit in the screen. I loop through them, and then I create a directive, and I'll try to explain this, but actually I'm not, because I'll look like a fool. But essentially what this lets you do is essentially just use these DND drag over, DND drop on your markup, and that's about it. Any questions on this? Because I'm sure someone on the Angular team will probably love to explain it a lot better. No? No? Huh? Nah, I'll pass. Let's see. This might be my last slide. I went through it pretty quick. Actually, not that quick, but I thought I'll go way faster. Sure.
So hang on.
Oh, wait, you want to wait for the mic? Let's make Robbie run a bit.
So when you're usually doing HTML5 drag and drop, one of the things you have to do is kill the event propagation when you're doing. I didn't see that there. Is that?
Well, on my code, it actually has the stop propagation on this one. On the Angular one, Angular actually kills it for you.
Oh, I see.
I didn't do anything. Angular just killed those propagation.
Oh, so you're using Angular drag. I didn't even know Angular had a
No, this actually writes the drag and drop.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure. I think I'm not pretty sure of anything, so I'll leave it. But Angular by default stops the propagation. So when you actually do an ng click, you don't have to do like E prevent default or anything like that. Angular handles all that.
Okay.
So this is written just like the ng click, and handles it stops the propagation and everything.
Cool. Are you sure about that? I thought ng click actually calls stop propagation inside of its implementation.
I'm actually for that I'll be pretty sure. I think it doesn't, but we could totally check it. Actually, it's pretty easy to look at it right now. So we'll see how I come up with this crap. I have my console here. Angular. Yeah, and I'll drag it over when I have it, because it'll be hard to type looking backwards. Dun, dun, dun. Almost got it. Which I found weird because I was like, I didn't have to like stop the event, which was weird, but it totally worked. I gotta remove the build. Build. Right. There we go. Forms into scenario. I know where this is at. This is show high, forms.js. Dun 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 dun. Source ng directive.
Hey Eric, do you want to just pull up GitHub so you can?
Well, I actually have the source because I have a local build where I was patching it to do that.
Sorry, you were saying it should like prevent default, or it should not?
I am pretty sure that it does not prevent default by itself. Like, if you're talking about ngClick, ngClick does, but if I'm remembering correctly, if you go and look at the implementation of ngClick, it calls prevent default and stop propagation itself. It doesn't. It's not like the Angular jQuery Lite thing. I don't think it does it automatically.
So, actually had a slightly tangential question, but that doesn't seem to work in IE. Do you know if that's being addressed at all?
I don't. If something's broken in IE, like file a ticket, I guess, because like I'm not actually on the Angular team. I just use it. If there's a bug, then someone will probably fix it.
Thanks.
I totally can't find the ng controller. Oh. All right, so let me drag this over. So if we look at the Angular implementation, I could zoom it in, but my thing is not meant to. So Angular does the same thing. They have the for each, the directive, the bind, and the apply. Am I looking at the wrong place?
No, I think that's right. Maybe you're right about this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like the only thing I was confident about because I looked at this a lot and tried to figure out what it's doing. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I guess. Well, in my project we use jQuery, which if jQuery is defined before Angular loads, then it will use jQuery instead of its own jQuery Lite thing. So maybe the jQuery Lite just differs from jQuery in this respect. Okay.
Any other questions? Preferably a lot simpler.
Over here, Eric.
Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, this might be a newbie question. The whole sort stuff kind of went over my head. Did you write a sort method, or is that built into?
No, it's actually built in.
Into Angular.
Yeah.
Is it all different data types, currency, number, like all different? So it's built in. I'm assuming it's like robust. It handles like currency, strings, and.
I only did text, but I'll let him answer the robustness of it.
Eric, you got a mic on your.
I do, but I'm not gonna like lean over and hug him. I know we could do that. We could totally do that. It's fine.
Later, man. Later. We'll get that hug. So
I'm glad you brought that up because I've been playing. I remember the first time I discovered that Angular just gives you that, which was awesome. I mean, it was just an awesome moment. I cried a little bit. What's happening is Angular. So whatever object collection it is you attach to the model that's bound to the repeater, Angular automatically gives you full text search on that object. So for the most part, I think it's strings and numerical values, but it's full text. So what's really cool about that is you can search on fields that aren't visible or aren't even used inside of the directive or the repeater directive. So one of the examples I showed a little bit last time was this app that let you sort movies, and so I could have the movies that showed up, the titles displayed, and that sort of thing. But I also had on the objects attached to the NG repeater genre fields and rating fields and things like that, so you could search on things that weren't visible. So it automatically, out of the box, gives you full text search on whatever collection it is you put on that repeater. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So one thing I ran into that with this example is when you do the search query. When you start typing, let's say you start typing something like chromeHAR, as you can see, they all kind of like get filtered because they all have it on the actual object, which is the full URL, which is something like that. And I think the way I didn't work around on this version. There's questions.
Hi. During your project, did you run into any sort of controller-to-controller kind of communications? Like, I didn't see kind of how this is mapped out.
No, because I only have one.
Have you before? Like, because it's something that I feel that a lot of people do it with just kind of like bouncing stuff off of the root scope, but kind of unhappy with that. So
this guy, he knows.
Yeah, we have that same problem. So one of the things we did is bouncing stuff off the root scope is actually not a bad way to do things. And so what we're doing is when we want one controller to talk to another controller, we're firing the event on the local scope. Wait, I think that's right. So we're broadcasting the event on the local scope and listening to the event on the root scope, right? So so you do a scope.broadcast, and then whatever controller it is that needs to perform an action on that event does a root scope.on and listens to that event. Or is it the other way around? I clearly made that up. Right. Yeah, I'm nodding my head like I already knew that for sure. But and one of the problems I think that you might run into is your event names get kind of hard to manage. If you're writing these event listeners and event broadcasts and lots of different modules, and to get around that, having a constant service or something like that where you define all of those names is probably the best thing to do, so you don't have to worry about some string changing by a character and breaking a whole series of events. But so using the root scope, I think, is actually a good way to do things. So.
No more questions? Oh.
And just for the record, tonight's Eric's birthday. So thank you for coming out and presenting on your birthday, Eric.
Yeah.